So today, as we begin the month of March, hard to believe, the theme is transformation. And I want to introduce some of you and remind others of you of a contemporary theologian, Unitarian Universalist theologian, John Luther Adams, who was fondly referred to as JLA. Adams taught at several liberal seminaries, and he influenced a generation of UU ministers and modern Unitarian Universalist thought. Adams actually attended the University of Minnesota as an undergrad, and during that time he discovered John Dietrich, who was the minister serving the First Unitarian Society, which is our mothership. During his lifetime, he transitioned from religious fundamentalism to a period where he rejected all religion, to scientific humanism, and finally to a liberal Christianity under the umbrella of Unitarianism. He served our tradition as a minister, a teacher, and a preeminent theological scholar. I remember Adams because of a story he tells about being in Nazi Germany. He talks about being on the side of the streets when Nazi forces paraded through the street, and as American, perhaps he didn't get the memo about how dangerous it was to be a free thinker in Germany at that time, and he ended up getting in a dispute with a Nazi supporter on the sidelines. And the argument grew from one person to a crowd of Nazi supporters, and then all of a sudden he was yanked from the crowd and pulled into a secluded alley. And there he was schooled by a fellow skeptic on the danger of speaking one's mind at that time in Germany. Linda and I just finished watching the mini-series, All the Light We Cannot See. If you haven't seen it, it's intense and very interesting. It's based on a novel by Anthony Doerr. The story is set during World War II in a coastal town in France that was a strategic stronghold of Nazi Germany. And the storyline is one of acts of courage and resistance at a time that once felt unfathomable. With fascism lurking in contemporary America, led by one of our presidential candidates, I found myself watching such things with less of a comfortable distance than I once knew. There's lots of formidable giants out there these days. So I see why the story of David and Goliath has such staying power. It's a story that we all know, perhaps not that intricate story, but we know the story, one that has moved beyond Sunday schools and sermons into the secular world. The story represents the little guy going after the big guy, the underdog going after the giant. If you Google the words 5 smooth stones, you'll find something like this from the Jesus is the Answer, Jesus Loves You website, which says that David chose 5 smooth stones in order to prepare for his battle against Goliath. This displays David's true heart, his complete confidence, trust, and faith in God. The 5 smooth stones represent what David carried in his heart: faith, trust, courage, obedience, and praise. These and other such websites espouse that along with the stones, David brought God by his side, because God always brings victory to those who are faithful in these stories. We UUs aren't opposed to Bible stories or to learning from them as ancient sacred texts. There's certainly are lessons to be learned, but what's problematic for us is the interpretation of the Bible and the motivation behind specific ways that biblical stories are interpreted. Interpretation implies subjectivity, and although fundamentalists will say that the Bible is the truth and deny any subjectivity, we know that's not the case. The worst part of biblical interpretation is when the retold story with a heavy layer of doctrine or church law is placed on top of the story, so that the actual story and opportunities to interpret it or to explore its meaning in different ways is no longer available. One could see the story of David and Goliath not as God being on David's side, but one instead of a very creative young boy outsmarting the giant. One of a boy not playing by conventional rules. We are people who critique convention. We are curious and we have a tendency to question things, whether that is authority, people who speak the truth, which isn't always the truth, or conventions, whether they be those of gender conformity or overt consumerism. And when it comes to faith, we are people of an examined faith. I've heard this confrontation between David and Goliath being called asymmetrical warfare. It makes me think of acts of nonviolence that defy the oppression and violence of those in power. It makes me think about how can we have asymmetrical warfare with what's going on these days. It makes me think of the characters in that miniseries, All the Light We Cannot See, who defied the Nazis in all sorts of underground and courageous ways. So what would you want in your bag so that you could face the giants that challenge our core values? What would it take for you or me to be as confident as David or others who have gone to battle with giants? What might you have at your disposal to disarm those who are causing harm? What might you pick up and have with you as you enter into a situation that feels challenging but necessary? I heard a congregant, isn't that wind something? I see people listening. It's really wild. Those of you who are at home, we have this like constant wind blowing. I feel like we're like out in Oklahoma during the dust storm or something. I heard a congregant from another congregation introduce Adams this way. Adam came to recognize religion as his passion and ministry as his calling. He entered Harvard Divinity School in 1924, and the entire quest of his professional career may be seen as a transformative response to his childhood religion. Transformative responses, not just to fundamental religion, but also to the fascism he saw in Germany and the conflicts that he witnessed here in the United States. So he grappled with theology of liberal religion. He grappled with it because our lives and our country depend on it. And as a beloved teacher, he came up with the idea of these 5 smooth stones as a way to summarize the basis of a liberal faith and to remind us of a core that is beautiful, practical, and critical for a just and loving society. So here are the 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism in JLA's words, followed by a few words from a UUA curriculum that helps kind of translate it a little bit. The first one is that religious liberalism depends on the principle that revelation is continuous. We talk about this a lot, that our religion is a living tradition because we are always learning new truths. The second one is that all relations between people ought ideally to rest on mutual free consent and not coercion. We choose freely to enter into relationship with one another. The third is that religious liberalism affirms the moral obligation to direct one's effort towards the establishment of a just and loving community. And this can be seen just as the work of justice. And then the fourth is that we deny the immaculate conception of virtue and affirm the necessity of social incarnation. Note, this is where I have often closed the book and decided that I could not figure out Adam's approach. Those words just sort of threw me. Did I mention that his writing is very intense and academic? So the UU curriculum simplifies this to agency. Good things don't just happen. People make them happen. That's a little easier to digest. And then finally, liberalism holds that the resources, both divine and human, that are available for the achievement of meaningful change justify a spirit of ultimate optimism. Translation, hope. Hope. So I'd like to take just a little bit of time to dive deeper into these and to share a bit more about Adam's theology. It's good for us every now and then to mull over that, I think particularly from a liberal perspective. So the first stone is to remind us that revelation is continuous. Adam says, meaning has not been finally captured. Nothing is complete, and thus nothing is exempt from criticism. Our religion is a living tradition because we are always learning and we're guiding our faith into the future. This whole Article 2 work that we're doing right now is part of that in the Unitarian Universalist Association. Adams grappled with ultimate things. That's what most theologians do. The question of God with both a big G and a little g, and some ultimate source or force. He said that the human depends for our own being and freedom upon a creative power and upon processes not ultimately of our own making. He continues, the liberal's ultimate faith is not himself. He understands that some may call this creative power God, while others would not. He says, to be sure, the word God is so heavily laden with unacceptable connotations that it is, for many, scarcely usable without confusion, and is therefore well for us to indicate briefly what the word signifies here. He says the word God may be replaced by the phrase that which ultimately concerns humanity, or that in which we should place our confidence. I imagine this is still a leap for some humanist among us, but I think what he's pointing to here is the mystery and the fact that we are here, we live, we die, we interact with each other, and it's attributed to something beyond us. He explains that we put our faith in a creative reality that is recreative. Revelation is continuous. As I mentioned, Adams changed faith throughout his lifetime, and at that time in Nazi Germany made him deathly aware of what the suppression of ideas and beliefs look like. He recognizes how conservative religions are unmovable. The Bible is written by God. The Bible says, therefore, you must do, be, act, believe in a certain way. Adams, however, was a questioner, something that those of you who are raised in strict doctrinal religions know is not particularly welcomed. We need to be open to criticism in order to be an examined faith. And he also believed that we as individuals need to evolve and stay open to new learning. I remember hearing this story a long time ago about First Unitarian Society in Chicago, which was the congregation JLA belonged to in 1948. The church was discerning if they should desegregate. Congregants fell into each different side, some in favor and some opposed. So the Board of Trustees took up the question in order to make a final decision. Adams sat on the board, and during this time, he was deeply committed to desegregation, and he wanted the church to vote in favor. The story is that the board debated into the early hours of the morning, and there was a member of the board who was really opposed, and he passionately argued his point, and he would not back down. It's said that at one point in the conversation, Adam asked the man, "What do you say is the purpose of this church?" Silence filled the room, and everyone was all ears. No one wanted to miss the reply to this critical question. And as Adam reflects on this story, he says the man described, he said he could see this man being opposed to people, but he also could see this man listening to people who he knew and loved throughout the evening. He didn't just listen with his ears, but he also listened with his heart. And finally, the man said, "Okay, Jim, the purpose of this church is to get hold of people like me and to change them." Talk about transformation. Revelation on an institutional and on an individual level is not sealed. We continue to learn and come to new truths through experiences and knowledge and stories. The second stone focuses on the freedom of association. This was really big for JLA. All relations between persons ought to rest on mutual free consent and not on coercion. You can hear the Nazi Germany piece coming in there. He cherished his freedom and the right to choose what groups and organizations we will join. And by joining, he believed that you also needed to support these institutions as well. Loyalty and affiliation or association come by free will, attraction, and by choice. The third of his stones of a free faith focuses on justice, and he believed that each of us is obligated, morally obligated, to direct our effort towards establishment of a just and loving community. He says that a faith that is not the sister of justice is bound to bring us grief. It thwarts creation, a divinely given possibility. I love that. A faith that is not the sister of justice thwarts creation and a divinely given possibility. This is why I find conservative faiths that damn people who fall outside of their narrow definition of what is right so offensive. I believe that each person is part of creation with a divinely given possibility, and that we each should be able to express our core beings and be celebrated and safe and supported and to be surrounded in love. JLA would have loved our newly articulated values with love at the center, touching all. He said that the reign of God, the reign of sustaining, commanding, and transforming reality is the reign of love. A love that fulfills and goes beyond justice. A love that cares for the fullest personal good of all. He continues, this love isn't something that is ultimately created by us or that is even at our disposal. It seizes and transforms life, bringing us into a new community that provides new channels for love and new structures for justice. He speaks firmly about powers that are most subtly destructive in the social life, where individuals' egotism fights under the camouflage of the good of the nation, the race, the church, or the class. Fascism under the guise of nationalism, faith, and gaslighting around race and class. The fourth stone is really about institutional power. He says that anything that exists effectively in history has to have a form. Kind of makes sense. And that the creation of a form requires power. It requires not only power of thought, but also power of organization and the organization of power. He understands that organizations are complicated and messy, and he reminds us that the core of our faith, he reminds us that this is the core of our faith and the call to justice. He says the community of justice and love is not an ethereal fellowship that is above the conflicts and turmoil of the world. It's one that takes shape in nature and history. It's one that requires the achievement of freedom with respect to material sources, as well as with respect to spiritual resources. Indeed, he said, the one kind of freedom is not fully authentic without the other. Freedom, justice, and love require a body as well as a spirit. And he believes that communities like this one is what he calls forms of goodness in society. Faith isn't a solo endeavor. He says no one can properly put faith in a merely individual virtue, even though that's a prerequisite for societal virtues. The faith of the liberal must express itself in societal forms. The faith of the liberal must express itself in societal forms, in the forms of education and economic and social organization, and in political organization. Without these, freedom and justice and community are impossible. So the work of the person of liberal faith and communities like ours that sustain us are critical to the greater cause of freedom and justice. And that leads me to the fifth stone. In JLA speak, the resources, divine and human, that are available for achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. This has actually just been summarized with one simple word: hope. This need for hope comes from a man who understood the reality and the atrocities of war. He described war as the relentless revealer. I think that's kind of interesting. War is a relentless revealer that presents the human powers of aspirations. He said, we don't neglect the realistic and the tragic, but we sense that at the depths of human nature and the boundaries of what we are, there are potential resources that prevent a retreat into nihilism or the belief that life is meaningless. A colleague of mine boiled down the 5 smooth stones to possibility, respect, justice, agency, and hope. We do live in troubling times, and we need all the tools we can have to navigate the social, economic, and political realities of our time. And I hope that by learning or being reminded of JLA's 5 smooth stones helps ground you in our faith a little bit and connect you to our predecessors who grappled with challenging times of their own. Gather your stones so you can feel equipped to confront those who challenge our very livelihood of our nation and our beloveds. And remember always to center love. I'll close with these words about love by JLA. The reign of God, with a little g, the reign of sustaining, commanding, transforming reality is the reign of love. A love that fulfills and goes beyond justice, a love that cares for the fullest personal good of all. This love is not something that is ultimately created by us or that is even at our disposal. It seizes and it transforms life, bringing us into a new kind of community that provides new channels for love and new structures for justice. May we all be transformed by love. May it be so, and amen.